So as we had the first slide up there, we're here to talk about amino today. And I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of background about the company for those of you that have not been here with us before, maybe new to BW Fusion. So Sean, can you go on to the next slide? My name is Jerry Burton. I'm the Vice President of Sales with BW Fusion. I started out with Biodyne to begin with, and as we became BW Fusion, was a rep and then moved into management. Been around about 6 years now, and it's been fun to watch the evolution of our company and the evolution of our dealers and growers that work with us. So who is BW Fusion and what are we? We're an innovation and an education company. Next. Innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity, not a threat. That's a quote by Steve Jobs, and one that we really embrace, as well as the one next to it by Nelson Mandela. Education being the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And what we are doing is we are challenging the status quo of traditional agronomy and fertility practices. And that's being done with innovative technologies and education to promote soil resiliency and increase growers' ROI. A little bit more about BW Fusion, our mission. We want to educate and innovate with data-driven crop nutrition programs that maximize your farm's profitability and puts the control back in the grower's hands. So we are family-owned and operated. We are not, there's no venture capital money or outside funding. It's all, basically, and for those of you who don't know, BW Fusion is basically the fusion of Biodyne and Wells Ag Supply. And that relationship between Biodyne and Wells Ag Supply is what drove us to where we are today. And relationships continue to be what drive us. And we're culture focused. We're family oriented, and we work hard and have a lot of fun. And then we want our customers to win. If you win, we all win. We are the manufacturer of the Biodyne microbial technologies and the BW innovations from concept to finished product. So we control our own destiny from that standpoint. And we are obsessed with the data-driven decisions and results. So we utilize the Agronomy 365 program to show people what our products are doing, in an treated and untreated scenario. And we also use it to look at how can we improve things through a new innovative product that utilizing that data to decide what needs to be in a product to affect those crops. So I'm going to introduce the two gentlemen you see sitting next to each other on the screen. On the left there, Mason Claude, obviously, he matches that picture. I was really good at that matching game as a kid. So Mason Claude, a very young guy, but very knowledgeable for his age. And his passion drives him sometimes even to making himself sick, working so hard out in the fields and crop scouting. But very knowledgeable young man that has come a long way since he started with us, where he was nervous to talk in front of people. And now it's like second nature to him. He's grown a lot. It's been fun to watch. Sitting next to him on the right, Sean Nettleton. Sean comes to us with a wealth of knowledge. Many of you may know that Sean used to work for Beck's and had a lot to do with the PFR, and his knowledge is second to none. He's a phenomenal agronomist. And with that said, I'm going to hand off the show to these two, the guys with all the knowledge, and let them tell you more about Amino. We thank you for being here today. We appreciate your time, and let us know how we can help. Also, one other note, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them as we go. But if we don't get them answered during the webinar, we can reach out to you personally and get those answered as well. So thanks again. Take it away, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. So just to kick it off from a 1,000-foot view, we'd like to cover just even what an amino acid is. Starting to be a little bit of a buzzword out on the countryside. A lot of people are hearing about it, but not understanding necessarily what it is. And so just from a long 1,000-foot view again, where an amino acid is an organic molecule made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So specifically one amine group, which is where your nitrogen comes from, then a carboxylic acid group, which is where your carbon, oxygen, hydrogen come from. And why amino acids are important altogether is because every amino acid has its own specific function within a plant, whether it's coenzymatic processes or some sort of metabolism in the plant. But on top of that, it is the absolute foundation of all proteins in your plant. So your plant cannot make proteins without creating amino acids from those nutrients, nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen. In nature, there's over 500 different types of amino acids, but only 20 of those amino acids are utilized in protein formation. And so essentially, we're going to cover what, I guess, amino is in general, but overall, the reason why amino acids are important directly to plant production is because amino acids are what build the raw proteins inside the plant. So no conversion necessary, which I'll get into a little bit. So a couple things to know about amino acids. So again, as we kind of start talking about amino acids on the countryside and stuff, what are some different amino acids you might run into or hear about? First of all, is L-amino versus D-amino acids. Doesn't sound all that important. However, L-amino acids are plant recognizable. They're native to the plant. They're very readily usable. D-amino acids are synthetic. They're microbially produced. They are not necessarily foreign material to that plant. That plant has to, metabolize it, or in other words, not really use it very efficiently. Another thing too to keep in mind is free versus bound amino acids. So bound amino acids are a finished protein. So you're not going to actually be able to utilize that amino acid for any of those metabolic processes that it might be involved with. So it is raw protein, which is good, but free amino acids would be really what you want if you want to influence things such as stress mitigation or chlorophyll production. And so another thing that I actually found really interesting too is amino acids are electrically inert. So for any chemistry nerds who love high school chemistry, you'll remember every nutrient's got a charge, right? Amino acids are totally neutral. And so with that being said, what's really interesting is that amino acids can easily get right into the plant, no problem at all, especially L-amino acids that are plant recognizable native material. And so they carry no charge, which means that they're not going to compete with any sort of nutrient uptake. They're not going to compete with anything. They just fluidly move into that plant. And so it's going to aid in the absorption of nutrients. So whether that's foliar applications, if you're pairing amino with full sun, or maybe using it in a wide drop, or soil applied applications where you're utilizing those amino acids to increase efficiency and uptake of those nutrients you're applying. So the product itself, amino, is 17 L-amino acids, 85% free amino acids, which is high concentration. A lot of people will typically run anywhere from 10 to 30%. This is 85% free amino acids, L-amino acids. So again, they're all able to perform their metabolic processes as well as directly influence protein production in the plant. Because of that, Sean will get into it more, but you will conserve a lot of energy from not having to convert nitrate to nitrite to ammonia to amino acids, all that sort of thing. And so when we conserve energy like that, that energy is ATP, it's sugar. We can utilize ATP for other metabolic processes now that we would otherwise be wasting on converting nitrogen. And so we get to conserve a lot of sugar, and that allows us to drive higher sugar content into the plant, which leads to a whole can of worms of possibilities of what higher sugar content in the plant can lead to, but overall is a direct attribute of yield. Also maintains protein levels while plant metabolizes herbicide or influences seed size during grain fill. Makes a lot of sense, right? These are the building blocks for protein. And if everybody's on the same page that kernels are made of protein, then chances are that using amino is going to increase protein production in your kernel. So again, Sean's going to talk about application timings, but overall amino itself is a high concentration native L-amino acids that are plant recognizable, usable to the plant, that can be used for metabolism as well as protein production.
All right, so a little bit more about amino. So we think about use and timing. These are the things that are important from the perspective of when can we use them and at what time should we apply them. So we kind of broke it down in a way that we thought made sense. So let's say if you're going to go out pre-emerge. So if you're going to apply BW Prime, Biocast Max, if you're putting UA in maybe in a 2x2 application or something like that, we could apply amino at 24 to 32 ounces. And what we would be doing there is kind of stimulating that biology, providing a food source, and getting that biology going with amino in that case. Post-emerge. So let's say you're making a Biocast Max pass or a full sun pass. Again, we look at amino at 24 to 32 ounces there. And then if we're going with a herbicide pass, this is kind of a recommendation that we started to make. Anytime we apply a herbicide, 12 to 16 ounces of amino, just from a perspective of recovery and stress mitigation. And kind of what we mean by that is anytime we apply a herbicide, we know that that plant has to take that herbicide. It has to metabolize that. It has to break it down. And so essentially, whether it's a wheat or whether it's a corn plant or a soybean plant or whatever crop you're growing, wheat, any number of crops, that's a stressful period. That plant is essentially stopping the functions of which it's trying to do, right? So plants are trying to grow, trying to get to reproduction. Herbicides will basically stop those plant functions. And what we're doing is with amino, I think we gave a little bit of a deficit on an uptake aid to some extent, but we'll also get that stress and recovery. We're applying those amino acids to get that plant cranking again. So get that corn plant to metabolize that chemistry faster, get it through its system and get it back.
Especially, from the perspective of early season rooting. We all know how important early season rooting is. We've talked about nodal roots a million times on if you've heard us at road shows or anything like that. And whenever you apply a herbicide, you shut down sugar mobility to your root system for 5 to 7 days, right? So
absolutely,
essentially by pairing amino with that post herbicide application, by speeding up that metabolism, now maybe you're only shutting the root cycle down maybe from 2 to 3 rather than 5 to 7. So you're going to keep driving that early season nodal root growth.
Absolutely. And then we can look at a side dress or a wide drop pass. And once we get into later season, we'll start to raise that rate a little bit. But side dress or wide drop at 32 to 40 ounces. Again, Mason talked about some of the different things that the amino acids do. And so, aid in the uptake, providing some biological food, stress mitigation, getting those proteins going. And so we can apply that in a side dress or a wide drop. Late vegetation, with full sun. Again, we talked about full sun early in the post-emergent. We're doing a late vegetation application of full sun, 24 to 32 ounces of amino in that case, or if we're applying fungicide. And I think this is going to be obviously the stage of the growing season we're in. We're starting to get a lot of questions, a lot of conversations are geared around that fungicide pass. I know for me personally, whether it's corn or soybeans at this stage of the game, I'm applying just kind of a rule of thumb. I'm going to apply a quart of amino with these fungicide passes. And I think, depending on that crop, we can go a little bit deeper in that. I think Mason will talk a little bit about, soybeans from that perspective and late season nitrogen, but I think about it from a prospect of energy, and we're going to talk a little bit deeper about that. How do we conserve some energy and keep those plants moving down the line as we go into that critical grain fill period? And then again, reproduction for a fungicide, again, at 32 to 40 ounces, depending on when you're applying. So late vegetative, you mentioned that. That's like your, say, V12, V13, V14, maybe V10 fungicide passes that a lot of folks make. And then reproduction would be your tassel, maybe R2 fungicide pass there. So the other thing that we popped up here, and I think this is important, is that fungicide will inhibit nitrogen reductase. And the addition of amino supplies things like molybdenum. We'll call it moly from here on out because molybdenum can be a bit of a mouthful. But moly to continue the nitrogen cycle. So much like what we talked about in the post-emergence piece. When you've applied that herbicide, you're trying to recover, you're trying to mitigate that stress. The thing that we often, I think, don't talk enough about when it comes to fungicides is that fungicides, while they provide a lot of plant health and they will mitigate stress from an ethylene perspective, One of the things that they also do is they kind of slow that plant down. They stop the nitrogen reductase piece. So they stop converting that nitrogen into a protein. That plant just kind of gets lazy for a period of time after that fungicide, which a lot of times isn't something that we think about. We think we want to keep that plant moving along. And so pairing amino in that fungicide pass will help continue that nitrogen cycle, because we're at a critical stage there where we can't afford to miss a few days, right? We can't afford to slow down for a couple of days. There's a lot of processes that are happening. And it's kind of a situation where if you miss or you slow down for a couple of days, that plant doesn't go back and rebuild that energy. It's just lost for those days. And so that's something that amino can do to keep our plants moving forward and moving down the line.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the other kind of side of amino. So beyond the amino acids, it's also in the actual product itself. It's cobalt, molybdenum, and nickel. As Sean said, we'll probably call it moly from here on out. These three elements are needed in very small quantities, but they're very essential in the nitrogen production to go from nitrate to amino acid. And so molybdenum, like Sean just mentioned, is necessary in the conversion of nitrate to nitrite. The majority of the nitrogen you uptake from the soil into your plant is in the nitrate form. Nitrate reductase is a very necessary enzyme in order to change from nitrate to amino acid. And so what happens in the lack of nitrate reductase, or if we stop nitrate reductase production, what we're going to see is a lot of storage of nitrate in the tissue itself into its vacuoles, and it's going to cause oxidative stress. And so what molybdenum is going to do is it's going to help process that nitrate into nitrite to then go on to the further steps in the nitrogen cycle. So then cobalt is another very interesting element. So one thing cobalt is doing is causing ethylene suppression. So just for those of you that don't know, ethylene is a gaseous plant hormone that is basically a stress hormone. It causes senescent ripening. And so what we're doing with cobalt is we're suppressing ethylene using mineral nutrition, not a stimulant or a synthetic. And so when it says a slow burn effect, what we mean by that is that using nutrition, it's going to take a little bit longer in order to see that ethylene suppression effect. But because of that, and because we're doing things naturally using mineral nutrition, we're going to see ethylene suppression last for a longer period of time, rather than when you use a synthetic ethylene suppressant or a hormone, you might see it from 7 to 10 days. This is going to last a lot longer. So another thing, cobalt is very important with stress mitigation and antioxidant production. So I talked about oxidative stress with too high levels of nitrate. Nitrate is insanely available to that plant from the soil into the plant. Once it's in the plant, it's the most detrimental part of the plant because it has to be converted, and it causes oxidative stress really easily. And what cobalt is going to do is be able to produce these antioxidants to allow for healthier xylem and phloem, health, I guess. So you're going to have healthier bundle sheets. You're going to be able to move water and minerals easier and sugar down the phloem. The flavonoid and phenolic compounds, what those really are the plant's defense mechanism responses. So when you are creating flavonoid and phenolic compounds, what those are, the plant basically has a accumulation of defense mechanisms at that point. So when abiotic and biotic stress moves in, these compounds allow that plant to mitigate stress quite a bit. Necessary for protein synthesis. So cobalt is a catalyst. It is a element that's directly involved with the catalyst. Well, and I should define what a catalyst is. So catalyst is a molecule that drives a chemical reaction within the plant. So when we have cobalt, it is a direct conductor of this protein synthesis, where it's going to drive a lot of plant metabolism and increase protein synthesis rate, so we can pack on a lot of protein really quick. The other really cool thing about cobalt is it's directly used to create vitamin B12. And as far as plant nutrition, we never talk about vitamin B12. At least I never did. I don't think you ever did. But vitamin B12 is very important for nitrogen fixation. So when we talk about soybeans, Iowa's favorite cover crop, how do we manipulate higher levels of protein into a plant is through breeder rhizobium health. We talk about all the time. And we might use humics, fulvics, whatever it is to try to manipulate that. One thing we always forget about is how does that plant actually get atmospheric nitrogen into a protein form? And the answer is cobalt from vitamin B12 we're able to actually create that into a protein rather than just assimilate ammonia.
And plants can't make their own B12.
They can't.
So it has to come from the microbes or from the amino acids.
Exactly.
From the cobalt, minerals such as that.
Exactly. So then, moving on to nickel, essential for the urease enzyme, which converts ammonia and CO2 over into amino acids and proteins. And so another thing, again, back with iron metabolism and defense against pathogens, is nickel, much like cobalt, is necessary for phenolic compound production, which is essentially the plant's ability to defend itself during abiotic and biotic stress.
So I think a quick take home here is a lot of us have started to hear about moly. Moly's becoming more of a talked about addition to maybe a nitrogen program because of that conversion from nitrate to nitrite and that reductase that Mason talked about. But really for me, and I think even Mason, as we started to prepare for this, we knew we had moly, cobalt, nickel in amino. I think, but what we did was we started to dive in more and understand that cobalt and nickel may not be nutrients that you've ever heard of, but they're just as important, in smaller doses as any of the micros that we typically apply, broad scale.
And 50% of all soils are deficient in both, or especially cobalt.
Right. So a lot of what Mason has talked about is kind of demonstrated here. Now, what I'm going to say is, if you were at one of our road shows this winter, you probably saw this slide. This slide is a simplification of, kind of this entire nitrogen cycle and where it starts. Let's say if we apply a nitrate, or there's nitrate in the soil, to where it becomes a protein in the plant. There's a lot of other side pieces, and it's not just a straight, conversion of nitrate to nitrite, but I got a pretty simple mind, Mason. So I'm going to keep it as simple as I can for myself to make sure I can understand what we're talking about here. But the basic process of nitrogen in the plant is if a plant takes up nitrate, the nitrate reductase, so then we convert that into a nitrite. Nitrite converts into ammonia. There's a couple different things happen there, but from ammonia, we go into an amino acid, and from an amino acid, we form proteins, right? And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps in just what we're describing here. There are a couple more, but what we also know is that this step right here, from nitrate into an ammonia, requires 17% of the total plant energy to complete this conversion. So if you guys were on our full sun webinar, or you've heard us talk about full sun, you start to study photosynthesis, we know that what's happening is we harvest sunlight, and when we harvest sunlight, we essentially create sugar. The sugars travel through the plant, and in reproductive, we want those sugars going to the ear. We want some of those sugars going out the roots as root exudates to stimulate the soil, stimulate the biology. That is the energy. That is the plant's currency, is that sugar that's created in that process, right? And so we've talked about that. Just know that this conversion process of taking nitrate. So when we think about nitrate, we think about 32. We think about 28%. We think about our liquid ureas, but we also think about ammonia. We can think about urea, because what happens is we may apply, if we apply 32, we convert to nitrate relatively quickly. If we apply anhydrous ammonia, it starts out in the ammonium form and over time breaks down and becomes that nitrate piece.
Manure. Hog manure, it's very common for hog manure acres to have high levels of nitrate, even though we're applying organic forms of nitrogen.
And so we've talked about this, and that's exactly right. So any form of N we apply tends to have higher rates of nitrate, or over time becomes nitrate. And so it's almost counterintuitive that when we look at this and say, okay, if we uptake nitrogen, we've got 5 steps plus all the side little things that happen to get to the protein which we want. And when we apply ammonia, it actually goes backwards and then comes in easy and then has to go back forward, right? And so we start to talk about different nitrogen sources. We talk about the amount of energy that gets burnt. And so 17, so almost 20% of the total energy that the plant creates is done to make this conversion of nitrogen into a protein. And so what amino does is basically we apply the amino acid. So we get to the amino acid bubble right from the beginning. We skip those steps previous. And so we're essentially saving, we can make up a number, 10, 12, 15% of that energy conversion by taking it one step away from the finished product, which is a protein. What we can also do is we can kind of lower that, maybe lower the demand for the nitrate in general, because if we apply amino, nitrogen, we think about nitrogen. And on simplistic terms, we say nitrogen is what makes our plant green, it makes our plant grow, right? But nitrogen in itself gets broken down into that amino acid form. So if we can apply the aminos, by theory, we can use a little bit less of the nitrate, and we can get to the finished product much easier, much less energy burn.
And let's also not forget too that, when you're applying amino, not only are we getting a spike of amino acids, you go into higher protein production, but you're also getting that cobalt and a little bit of nickel that's going to be essential for what nitrate you have already uptaken and are being stored in the vacuoles of your plant. Whatever nitrate's already in your plant, we're going to be able to manipulate the turnaround, turning that nitrate into proteins, as well as spiking proteins into the plant. So we're going to spike it with amino acids and therefore proteins. But we're also going to increase the conversion of nitrate and ammonia into amino acids and proteins.
So not only are we making it to where we have less demand for nitrate potentially, but we make the nitrogen that we already have applied more efficient because we make the conversion faster, burning less energy. Right. So then we take that a step further, right? We talk about, as we get into, now it's the first week of July, so areas that planted early are starting to see tassels. We're starting to talk about fungicide applications, whether that's with an airplane, a drone, or a ground rig. We have options today, or even don't leave the helicopter guys out. So another thing that commonly goes in these passes is a foliar urea product. And so we've got a product that's 2500, we call it SRN. There's competitive products out there. If you've heard the brand Coron or Triazone or some of these different things. And those are products that we've utilized a lot. And so I've got the red line here, foliar urea, because you're essentially putting those in that ammonium form. I think that to compare and contrast here, those are slow release nitrogen. They can go on foliar. They can give us that shot of nitrogen as well. I think that we start to differentiate is, again, we're a step farther along. We're already in the amino acid form. We get the cobalt, moly, nickel, so we're getting stress mitigation and nitrogen efficiency from those. But I think another thing that we would be remiss if we didn't talk about is, especially in the airplane and the aerial application of those fungicides, we put those products on at 1 to 2 gallons to the acre, a lot of 1 gallon to the acre of some of those other products. We're applying 32 to 40 ounces of amino. We need some free water in our mixes in those cases so that we can mix our fungicides, a lot of times insecticides, other things that might go in the tank. We need some of that free water. So mixability, and then accomplishing the same effect, maybe, and I say the same effect from applying the nitrogen piece, but plus the addition of the nutrients that are with it. We do that with a much lower use rate. So, in my case, it makes pilots happier when they have to put less product, less weight in the tank, and they have less concerns with, plugging up sprays, planes, et cetera.
Remember at the beginning too about, amino acids not having a chemical charge, right? There's no penalty to applying an amino acid. There's no sort of exchange really when you apply an amino acid, it just goes in, right? Well, you fully apply urea, what do you have to do? You got to metabolize it, and it carries a charge. You have to give something in order to get something. Plus, then you have to metabolize that ammonia over to amino acids, which is going to require urease enzyme, therefore nickel, cobalt. And so essentially you're still at least 2 steps behind, in my honest opinion, compared to applying raw amino acids.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if anybody's been to any of my, presentation this winter, you've seen this slide a lot. It's something that I am just fascinated by, is again, Iowa's favorite cover crop. It's what everybody finds as a mystery at my home state anyway. How do we make these beans crank out, right? How do we go from 45 to 65 and 65 to 85, right? And truthfully, I believe it's strictly from protein production. If you think about the potential of a soybean plant and you count how many flowers and pods and nodes and whatnot, we should all be raising 200 bushel beans. It's just ridiculous how much potential these things have. And then they lose it all. And why they lose it is because of a lack of protein. So then they abort those flowers and pods. And so this is actually a study done. Well, I guess, first of all, we need to establish what does feed nodules. is sugar. So if we are spraying amino or full sun or frankly any of our products from that aspect, and we're increasing sugar production in that plant and sugar mobility in that plant, we're going to push more sugar, i.e. food source, to those Bradyrhizobium nodules. They don't care about that soybean plant other than the sugar that they get. So that's one way that we're manipulating it through aminos. We're conserving sugar, therefore allowing more of it to go to the flowers, the pods, and the roots. But then what happens to Bradyrhizobium nodules at our stages is R3, your bean hits a peak for Bradyrhizobium fixation. At R3, we're getting all these flowers, we're getting all these pods, right? We got all this crazy stuff going on. We got all these sinks above ground. We hit R4 and Bradyrhizobium N2 fixation gets cut by at least half, simply because there's all of this demand, those 200 potential pods up top, all this demand up top requiring all that sugar, and those Bradyrhizobium essentially quit. They don't have much food source to continue going, as well as struggling with things like maybe vitamin B12. And so one ways we can manipulate rhizobium health is A, get them established sooner, B, push sugar to them, conserve plant sugar, and move sugar to them. And then even during that period where they don't have as much sugar going to their root, because that's just a fact, we're not going to be able to totally offset that. There's sinks above ground that need sugar as well. But one way we can kind of also tweak that a little bit, again, back to cobalt driving vitamin B12 that is necessary for N2 fixation. It is absolutely necessary to convert that ammonia into protein for those beans. And anybody that's raised higher than beans, 80 bushel and plus, half the time you get the combine in rock picking mode because all the hot, nice, heavy, good pods are at the bottom of the plant, right? That's because the protein is moving from the bottom up. And so we're able to manipulate the overall size of those beans and pack on a lot of protein late season, the healthier we keep those. And so when we apply amino, we can be able to pack protein in the pods above ground. And then as far as Bradyrhizobium health, we're going to feed that thing cobalt, which is going to drive a lot of vitamin B12 production, which is going to increase the ammonia, the N2 fixation below ground and drive higher protein levels in the plant as well.
And so we may make multiple applications throughout a growing season if we start at the beginning because we're trying to accomplish different things. Yep. So in the case of a soybean crop, you start early to get your nodules cranking to make sure they're as efficient as possible. Herbicide time for stress mitigation, late season to kind of overcome some of that drawdown effect that we get as our nodules stop working as hard as they did earlier.
Absolutely, yeah. And then this study even kind of proved it, where they manipulated these nitrogen levels post R3 as if these Bradyrhizobium were still working. They were able to increase yield by about 30%, simply by increasing higher nitrogen levels late into the season. So anybody that's keeping up on Agronomy 365, Sean's seen it quite a few times. You hit about R3, it's kind of a peak of nitrogen. R4, it just crashes, right? Mm-hmm. You see that quite a bit. And the way we can kind of try to mitigate that is keep those Bradyrhizobium healthy and keep protein into that plant, i.e. amino. So here's some trials out of South America. Hopefully quite a few people have at least been familiarized with it a little bit. But obviously want to direct attention to the amino at tassel and corn. And so there's 8 bushel yield increase, but why we see that increase, again, all those attributes that we talked about today, but the stomatal increase is a measurement that I find really fascinating. Stomata are what allow water vapor out of your plant, allows that plant to respire and then uptake more water and minerals. It's also what's intaking CO2. And anybody that pays attention to crop production knows that CO2 is necessary for photosynthesis. And so when we can increase stomatal conductance, we automatically, no doubt, will increase the amount of sugar and ATP produced by that plant every time, as well as increase the amount of water and minerals that that plant can uptake, because we're allowing that plant to respire water and allow for more uptake and therefore more nutrient uptake through mass flow. Soybean trials also saw a very positive yield response. Just amino at R2 to R3 had a 6.5 bushel yield increase. And simply attributed to all those things we just talked about soybeans. How do we tweak soybeans just that much to try to get the next little sliver of bushels out of soybeans? Protein production.
And I think that stomatal conductance piece is really huge, because we think about, CO2. In my opinion, CO2 is would be one of the best crop response products. If we could, we say we could bottle it up and apply it, it would be phenomenal. And so pulling in more CO2, more carbon into that system, especially in a soybean, it makes a ton of sense.
There's a trial out of Iowa where, so essentially at V4, we had not applied anything besides BW prime. This is nitrogen levels in the tissue. And then after that V4 sample, he had applied Biocast Max, Full Sun, and Amino, and saw where the untreated, if we can all pay attention, we saw a decrease in nitrogen levels in the untreated check. Whereas in the treated, we saw not only at sustained nitrogen levels, but increased nitrogen, which is very important to see as we go through the season. Is to see it even trend the same, frankly, is a win, in my opinion. If you can see nitrogen stays the same level, it starts out high and it stays at that level, I think of that as a win. If it starts out at a 4.3 and it even upticks a little bit, that's even better.
Well, you think about that from a perspective, and the reason why it's important to try to maintain and grow is it would be great if at V4 and then you took it again at V4 because if the plant stayed at the same size, it's one thing, but you got to remember that plant's getting bigger. A soybean plant gets bigger, a corn plant gets bigger at growth stage. And so for uptake to keep up with basically demand, there's a concentration factor there. Is the bigger that plant gets, a lot of times the more diluted our nutrients get. So I think that's why it's important when Mason mentions not only did it, stay the same, but it increased because the increased uptake, kept up pace with the increase in size of the plant.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, it would be remiss, I guess, it would be almost sacrilegious, as Mason says, for me to do a talk of any sort, without bringing up this slide. I think everybody internally always gives me a hard time because I always say this is my favorite slide of anything that we show, and I think it talks a lot about what we do at BW Fusion. Whether that's with our biology. Whether that's Full Sun creating more sugars, whether it's, because essentially what we're talking about here is plant and soil synergy. And I think it sums up what we're trying to do as a company, is that the plant feeds the soil and the soil feeds the plant. We know that, if we add biology to the soil and we stimulate those biology, they release more nutrients to that plant. So therefore we get that increase in nutrient uptake. If we maximize photosynthesis, then we create more sugars that we can send more sugars. If a plant's sending 30% of its created sugars to the soil, we create more. 30% of more is, it's just more, right? So if we can send more sugars, we stimulate that biology more, we get more nutrient release. And I think amino fits into this because it makes that plant more efficient at building its proteins. It makes it more efficient at growing. But not only that, there are amino acids, and we don't have the time to talk about every one of the amino acids that's in amino, but there are amino acids that are also aiding in that photosynthetic process, that are aiding in creating and maximizing photosynthesis so that we make more, so we capture more and make more sugars to go into that process of stimulating that biology and stimulating these plants. And so I think kind of recapping to some extent is amino is not just that nitrogen piece. It's not just getting a shot of moly, cobalt, and nickel and all the processes that it comes with, but you're also getting aminos that stimulate photosynthetic activity, that stimulate root growth, that mitigate stress, that do all these different things. And so, we talk a lot about Full Sun. We talk a lot about biology, and I think amino is a product, and we've talked about use rates and timing. What I didn't mention at that time was that this is probably the easiest product in our lineup to use because it mixes with everything. There's not a lot of issues that apply in this product with anything.
Not detrimental at any time.
And it's not detrimental at any time. We can use it from beginning to end, from in furrow to finishing out the crop. And it does so much more than just give us a little shot of nitrogen. So I think that's kind of tying that into what we talk about, from that plant and soil synergy piece. All right, and then this graphic, we sold this from the guys at 365, but what it really shows us is, kind of the correlation of WEOC, which if you've heard us talk before, You've heard Jason Schley talk. You've heard that term WEOC, that water extractable organic carbon. And we talk about that being a food source for biology and, working with us on the nitrogen side and everything else. And we think about this from, we're going to call it maybe a standard grower perspective, that there actually is a correlation with SLAN. And I need to tell you what SLAN is, and that's slow labile amino nitrogen. And basically, that is an extremely stable form of amino acid nitrogen as it resides in the soil. It's a metric that we look at, maybe one of the more important. We've all seen a standard soil test. You don't see SLAN on there, but SLAN may be a metric that we look at on our fleets and the indicator max, and it may be one of the. And what it's basically telling us is how stable the nitrogen in the soil is. It's in this amino acid form. And what we start to see is that they go together. And we've been talking about this amino nitrogen late in the season, and you can see from this graphic that in a standard situation where our WEOC starts to dive right about that tassel timing, we see that they correlate and the SLAN goes with it.
One real quick, actually, go back on that. You mentioned a traditional soil test, so I guess I'll throw it under the bus a little bit. If we're trying to pay attention to late season nitrogen, what does late season nitrogen go into? Protein production, right? The closer that thing is to a protein, the more apt we are to actually build proteins.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we take a nitrate test at tassel to try to see where we're sitting for nitrogen, we might be looking at what we're sitting for nitrate nitrogen, which congratulations, if you got a bunch of it, you've got one of the most inefficient forms of nitrogen for protein production. SLAN is used directly for protein production in the late season. So when we talk about late season, kernel growth, kernel density, 55% of all of your dry matter is determined between dent and black layer because of high levels of protein synthesis. And so if it is in the amino acid form, you will always have increased levels of protein production in that kernel.
So it speaks back to that efficiency of the form of N and how much energy that it has to burn, the plant has to burn to make that conversion. Whether we apply it foliarly or we have amino acid nitrogen in the soil, it's a metric that we really look at because it tells us how efficient that plant's going to be. And we're not going to, if we don't burn that energy, that's energy that goes into our ear. It's energy that goes into our pods. And I think that's the key takeaway is the form of N late in season determines to some extent, it maybe determines yield in some extent because of the amount of energy that we have to consume or that plant has to burn through to make it useful. And so we look at some of these high yield growers and some of the high yield data that we've seen is if we can maintain our WEOCs deeper into reproduction, if we can maintain that carbon source because of that correlation, we'll see that higher SLAN. And if we get that SLAN drop off much, much later, then we tend to see higher yields in that case because we keep that very efficient, very stable form of amino N available deeper into reproduction.
Which, frankly, those are kind of long-term practices in my standpoint. I feel like we can manipulate that year one in the soil, but I feel like it's something that takes some time. Whereas when you're applying amino acids, obviously it's getting into that crop right away, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's also something else to keep in mind when we talk about foliar applications of amino, is it kind of allows us standard yield guys to maybe try to manipulate or try to, I guess, copy a little bit of what these high yielding guys are. That is a way that we can implement it in our operations without having to maybe go to the extreme of what they do. So I just had to throw that out there.
No, that's great. All right. So, that's what we have for today. I'm sure that there was some Q&A. I assume that the questions that were asked have been answered. If there are more questions, I think we've got a little time to do that. But that's what we've got today. This is BW Fusion, the people, the products, and proof. We appreciate all of you jumping on and joining us. We didn't have this last webinar, we did, but there's my email, there's Mason's email, and Buck Brazil, who was our agronomist in Nebraska. Mason's in Iowa, and I cover basically Wisconsin down all the way through the Mississippi Delta. And, if you're in one of our areas or you have more questions about amino product, please reach out to your BW Fusion rep or take the time to send us an email and ask us what we.
You asked for questions. Here we go.
Here we go. Missed the part about carrier volume at VT fungicide. What was that piece again? And so I can touch on that real quick. With an airplane, you know, I don't have any issues. I think that's one of the things about amino. A lot of airplanes are running 2 gallon. It just is kind of a general rule of thumb, and there's no issues with amino going into the airplane. Quite frankly, we're taking up less free water with amino than we would be with some of the other foliar nitrogen products. So if you're ground rig, you can be anywhere from, you know, 10 to 20 gallon an acre. I've tended to go in times going ground rig fungicide, maybe against conventional wisdom, start to pull back carrier volumes a little bit to increase concentrations, but should be no restrictions really with carrier volume with that product.
Yeah, another really good question right here, essentially, is the yellow flash this year from soybeans, very common, but not is insane. How many beans, frankly, if anybody knows me, I'm pretty black and white, looked like crap for a long time. And we're a little bit of this yellow color, had this yellow flash, and this question's asked, is amino something that could have helped mitigate that? And essentially it can help mitigate it, but that yellow flash was caused from a handful of issues this year. Now, anywhere from IDC to HBPD and carryover. And so, you know, really it would just depend on what's honestly causing it. I would say if you had early season nodule health, if you were at V1, V2, and you already had a bunch of Brady rhizobium that are nice and pink and fixing nitrogen, I'm not necessarily sure that you were lacking in protein. You were probably lacking in something else. So maybe not necessarily amino would be the cure all necessarily. So, oh, we got any more in there?
They were answered already.
Oh,
I think
kid.
somebody's been in the background helping us out here. So, all right. With that being said, we appreciate everyone's attention and attendance. And like I said, if you have any further questions, reach out to BW Fusion rep or reach out to myself, Mason, or Buck. Obviously, most of you can get in touch with Bodie and let us know if you have any questions. And we appreciate your time today.
Thanks.